Hi everyone from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I'm Bob Ask once again to begin my story. The first in the chronological survey and series of my life as I lived it, studied it, and got to teach it for a long time. The place to begin, of course, is when I came along. And that was almost a century ago. Can you believe that? The 1920s. The famous, or perhaps you might say, the infamous 1920s. That long ago. On May 18th, 1926, 94 years ago, I came along. Cute little boy, born in Ottumwa, Iowa. Parents, Axel, a doughboy from World War I, coming from Sweden to Connecticut, out to Iowa, to find my mother, Martha, a doll-faced flapper, but not the usual type that we'll be talking about shortly. I joined my brother, 4 years older, John. Many of you remember John, track coach at Jefferson when I was a football coach and basketball, and we worked together for a long time. He was there already in the family, and 2 years later, my sister Miriam came along and completed that little family at 1315 East 4th Street in Ottumwa, Iowa, a little bungalow that I still consider a palace in my historical recollections. Now, what was going on in our country and in the world? What was America like when that little Bobby found his entrance into that decade? Well, 3 or 4 evidences or factors were prevalent and sort of framed the decade. Well, first of all, America was in the aftermath of the Great War. Notice we didn't call it the First World War then, for obviously there was no second as yet. The Great War. And America was still in the 20s reeling from that useless horror and waste that some historians now call 1914 to 1918 the perfectly stupid war. So when the 20s came along, that had never really yet disappeared. America, for example, lost 116,000 soldier boys in France, and that was minuscule compared to the losses of our allies, Britain, France, and Russia. How many died in battle and from illness, primarily the flu, incidentally? 8.5 million people died in the First World War. And that atmosphere was hard to get over. Secondly, at that time, America, partly because of that, was in a period of continued disillusionment from what they thought was be the idealistic, as President Woodrow Wilson said, it would be the war to end wars. Disillusioning. Americans turn to rejection from standards and values that had been the backbone of our culture. One such rejection was of those values and standards in what historians call the moral revolution. It was a time when behavioral values, traditions, and beliefs were sort of set aside or at least compromised. The symbols of that change that came about from the turn of the century are the Gibson girl of the turn of the century. She typified what our culture believed in moral values. And the change that came in the 20s that I would find in my new residence and country, the flapper, the famous flapper of the Roaring 20s. A second evidence of the disillusionment and now a rejection was America's reaction to prohibition, the bootlegging, and all that followed in the streets of Chicago and elsewhere around the country as part of that new climate of this decade. And a third development and descriptor of what we now call the 20s, the Roaring 20s, is where it got its name, roaring. America was in a time of booming and pent-up consumer motivation, spending, and economics. They were buying the Model T Ford and all the new models that came along. In fact, in the 1920s, we built a highway across the West, linking East and West during this time of interest. So it was a time of spending and boom. They say that between 1921 and 1929, that America's total wealth doubled between those years. The top target was the automobile, but there were a lot of other consumer lures that would make the Roaring 20s so unlike the next decade that follows, when trouble set in. And of course, we'll go into that later. Now, when I came along in the 1920s, it was also on the lighter side, the time of the jazz age. We said bootlegging meant the Untouchables. Remember them from those TV shows a while back. It was the time of Red Grange of Illinois, the Galloping Ghost. It was the time of Babe Ruth, the Sultan of SWAT, the Bambino. Bobby Jones was the best in golf. Bill Tilden was the best in tennis. And not to leave the ladies out, Gertrude Ederle swam the Atlantic. Jack Dempsey, the hero in the 20s before Joe Louis came along, and he and Muhammad Ali. It was the time of Rudy Vallée, the singer, and Rudolph Valentino. And, as you know, in the White House, Harding, Silent Cal, and the Iowan, Herbert Hoover. Well, things were kind of bad in some ways. We remember Al Capone, but things were good in other ways. Remember Billy Sunday? They both were in Chicago and are mentioned in that song, Chicago, Chicago, that toddling town, the town that Billy Sunday couldn't close down. So these were some of the features of the 20s. We'll remember this man, Babe Ruth. When we talk about baseball later in the series, we'll go into all the other standouts that came along in my lifetime and yours. And of course, there was probably the big single story in the 1920s when Charles Lindbergh flew the first non-stop transatlantic flight across the pond, as they called it, the Atlantic Ocean, eating his ham sandwiches and finally finding that little airport in Paris, France, 1927. I can remember in a few years beyond, my mom tells me every airplane that I found or saw flying overhead, I thought was Lindy. Why? They even sang a song about it. Lucky Lindy. Not so lucky a decade later. You'll have to wait, if you don't remember, to see what happened to the Lindbergh family. Well, that's the way things were in the 1920s when Bobby Ask entered the world in Ottumwa, Iowa. Now, next time we go to the 30s. Oh, here's a decade that now, by this age, I fully remember. A decade of war clouds, trouble overseas, the Great Depression, and our answer to the problems that lay ahead, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Next time when we get together. Bye now.